For decades, the shadowy underworld of organized crime has captured the imagination of the public, with mob bosses becoming the dark legends of their time. They ruled with iron fists, building empires of vice, corruption, and violence that extended from the streets of New York to the gambling halls of Las Vegas. In this documentary, we're delving deep into the lives and legacies of the 10 most ruthless mob bosses in U.S. history. These men weren't just powerful, they were notorious for their cunning, brutality, and unrelenting thirst for control. From strategic hits to elaborate criminal networks, their stories shaped American crime lore forever, leaving behind tales that continue to shock, intrigue, and mesmerize. Al Capone. Al Capone, one of the most infamous names in American organized crime, rose to power during the Prohibition era, a time when the illegal liquor trade was flourishing. Born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1899 to Italian immigrant parents, Capone's early years were marked by petty crime and gang involvement. However, it wasn't until he moved to Chicago in the early 1920s that he truly began his ascent to power. With a keen eye for opportunity and a ruthless approach to competition, Capone quickly took control of the city's underground economy. He built an empire centered on the illegal production and distribution of alcohol, capitalizing on the public's demand for liquor during the nationwide ban. Capone's influence extended beyond bootlegging. He controlled a vast network of gambling dens, brothels, and speakeasies, all of which contributed to his immense wealth and power. By the mid-1920s, Capone had become the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld, feared and respected by both allies and rivals. Capone's reign, however, was not without its challenges. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929 is perhaps the most infamous event associated with his rule. On February 14th of that year, 7 members of the rival North Side gang were brutally gunned down in a Chicago garage, allegedly on Capone's orders. While Capone was never directly linked to the massacre, the incident solidified his reputation as a cold-blooded mob boss, willing to do whatever it took to maintain his dominance. Despite his criminal empire's extensive reach, Capone's downfall came not from his violent activities, but from tax evasion. In 1931, after years of relentless pursuit by federal authorities, Capone was convicted of income tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. His conviction marked the beginning of the end for his criminal career, and after serving time in Alcatraz, he was released in 1939, a shadow of his former self. Capone's story remains a cautionary tale of power, greed, and the ultimate price of a life of crime. Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Charles "Lucky" Luciano is often credited with transforming the American Mafia from a disorganized collection of rival gangs into a highly structured and efficient criminal empire. Born in Sicily in 1897, Luciano immigrated to the United States as a child and quickly became involved in the New York underworld. By the 1920s, Luciano had risen through the ranks of the Mafia, gaining a reputation for his strategic mind and willingness to modernize the traditional ways of organized crime. His most significant contribution to the underworld was the formation of the National Crime Syndicate in the early 1930s, a loose confederation of criminal organizations that spanned the entire country. This syndicate brought together Italian, Jewish, and Irish crime groups, fostering cooperation among them in a way that had never been seen before. Under Luciano's leadership, the syndicate became a powerful force, controlling a wide array of illegal activities, including gambling, narcotics, and labor racketeering. Luciano's influence didn't stop at the formation of the National Crime Syndicate. In 1931, after orchestrating the murders of his former boss Joe Masseria and rival Salvatore Maranzano, Luciano established the Commission, a governing body designed to mediate disputes among the various mafia families and ensure that organized crime operations could run smoothly without unnecessary bloodshed. The Commission, composed of the heads of the most powerful crime families, was a revolutionary concept that helped maintain peace and order within the Mafia for decades. However, Luciano's criminal career hit a major roadblock in 1936 when he was convicted of running a massive prostitution ring in New York City. Sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, Luciano continued to exert influence from behind bars. During World War II, he struck a deal with the U.S. government to aid in the protection of American shipping from German sabotage, a move that eventually led to his early release in 1946. However, his freedom came with a catch. He was deported to Italy, where he lived out the rest of his days, far from the empire he had built. Despite his exile, Luciano's legacy as one of the most influential figures in the history of organized crime remains firmly intact. Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky, often dubbed the mob's accountant, was a mastermind behind the financial operations that fueled the American Mafia's rise to power. Born in 1902 in what is now Belarus, Lansky immigrated to the United States as a child and quickly found himself immersed in the world of organized crime. Unlike many of his peers, Lansky was not known for his brute force, but for his incredible financial acumen. He was instrumental in devising complex money laundering schemes that allowed the Mafia to hide its illicit profits from law enforcement, ensuring that vast sums of money could be moved, invested, and laundered without drawing attention. Lansky's ability to manage the Mafia's finances with precision and foresight earned him immense respect within the underworld, and he became a close associate of some of the most powerful mob bosses of his time, including Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Lansky's influence extended far beyond the United States, most notably into Cuba, where he played a pivotal role in the development of the island's lucrative gambling industry. In the 1940s and 1950s, Lansky, in partnership with Luciano, turned Havana into a haven for gamblers, with luxurious casinos that attracted wealthy tourists from around the world. Lansky's keen understanding of business and finance allowed him to negotiate deals that ensured the Mafia's control over these enterprises, making Cuba a major source of income for the American mob. Even as political tides shifted and the Cuban Revolution led to the nationalization of casinos in the late 1950s, Lansky's reputation as a financial genius remained untarnished. Throughout his career, he managed to avoid the same fate as many of his contemporaries. Despite numerous investigations and attempts to prosecute him, Lansky was never convicted of a serious crime. His legacy endures as one of the most financially astute mob bosses in history, a man who understood that power wasn't just about muscle, it was about money. Vito Genovese. Vito Genovese, known as Don Vitone, was a mobster whose ambition knew no bounds. Born in Italy in 1897, Genovese immigrated to the United States as a teenager and quickly became entrenched in New York's criminal underworld. His rise to power was marked by ruthless efficiency and a singular goal: to become the boss of all bosses in the American Mafia. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Genovese maneuvered through the intricate web of Mafia politics with a combination of cunning and brutality. He was involved in numerous power struggles, eliminating rivals and consolidating his influence within the Luciano crime family, which would later bear his name. Genovese's thirst for power was unrelenting, and he sought to position himself at the very top of the Mafia hierarchy, a goal that would eventually lead to significant bloodshed and turmoil within the underworld. One of Genovese's most notorious ambitions was his attempt to wrest control of the Mafia from its then leader, Frank Costello. In 1957, Genovese orchestrated an assassination attempt on Costello, which ultimately failed, but succeeded in forcing Costello to step down, clearing the way for Genovese to assume control. However, Genovese's reign as the de facto boss of bosses was short-lived. In 1959, he was convicted of drug trafficking in a high-profile case that exposed the Mafia's involvement in the heroin trade. Sentenced to 15 years in prison, Genovese continued to exert influence from behind bars, maintaining control over his crime family and orchestrating operations from his cell. Despite his incarceration, Genovese's legacy as a powerful and ruthless mob boss endures. Carlo Gambino. Carlo Gambino, often referred to as the Godfather, was the epitome of the quiet, calculating mob boss whose influence far exceeded his outward demeanor. Born in Sicily in 1902, Gambino immigrated to the United States in the 1920s, quickly establishing himself within the ranks of the New York Mafia. Unlike many of his contemporaries who sought power through overt displays of violence, Gambino's rise to the head of what would become the Gambino crime family was marked by patience, strategic alliances, and a deep understanding of the Mafia's inner workings. By the 1950s, Gambino had taken control of the family after orchestrating the assassination of his predecessor, Albert Anastasia. From that point on, Gambino ruled with a blend of old-world cunning and modern-day business acumen, making the Gambino family one of the most powerful and enduring criminal organizations in American history. Gambino's success was largely due to his ability to stay under the radar of law enforcement while exerting significant control over the Mafia's operations. He was a master at avoiding the limelight, preferring to pull strings from behind the scenes rather than engage in public displays of power. This low-profile approach allowed him to avoid the legal troubles that plagued many of his peers, keeping him out of prison for most of his life. Gambino was also instrumental in shaping organized crime policy, advocating for a more business-like approach to the Mafia's activities. He emphasized the importance of keeping violence to a minimum to avoid unwanted attention from the authorities and worked to maintain a level of order and discipline within the Mafia that had been lacking in previous years. His influence extended beyond his own crime family, as he played a key role in the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, where his decisions helped shape the direction of organized crime in the United States for decades. Frank Costello, famously known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, was a unique figure in the American Mafia, known more for his diplomacy and political connections than for brute force. Born in Italy in 1891 and raised in New York City's Little Italy, Costello's rise through the ranks of the Mafia was characterized by his keen intellect and ability to navigate both the criminal underworld and legitimate society. Unlike many of his peers, Costello was not driven by a desire for overt power or violent dominance. Instead, he became the Mafia's go-to mediator and diplomat. His charm, combined with a shrewd understanding of the political landscape, allowed him to forge alliances with influential politicians, law enforcement officials, and business leaders, securing protection and opportunities for the Mafia's operations. Costello's role as the Mafia's unofficial ambassador earned him respect across the underworld, and he became a key figure in the Luciano crime family, eventually stepping into leadership after Luciano's imprisonment. Costello's influence extended beyond the traditional rackets of gambling, bootlegging, and extortion. He was deeply involved in political corruption, using his connections to manipulate elections, secure government contracts, and protect the Mafia's interests at the highest levels of power. His foray into legal gambling operations, particularly in Louisiana, further demonstrated his ability to blend legitimate business with organized crime, making vast profits while maintaining a veneer of respectability. However, Costello's power began to wane in the 1950s, culminating in an assassination attempt in 1957. The attempt on his life, orchestrated by rival Vito Genovese, left Costello wounded but alive. Despite surviving, the incident convinced Costello to step down from his leadership role, signaling the decline of his influence within the Mafia. Though he retreated from active involvement in organized crime, Costello's legacy as a sophisticated, politically savvy mob boss who preferred brains over brawn remains a fascinating chapter in the history of the American Mafia. John Gotti. John Gotti, known as the Teflon Don, was one of the most notorious and publicized mob bosses in American history. Born in the Bronx in 1940, Gotti rose from a life of petty crime to become the head of the Gambino crime family, one of New York's most powerful mafia organizations. Unlike his predecessors who preferred to operate in the shadows, Gotti embraced the spotlight, cultivating a public persona that made him a household name. His flamboyant style, expensive suits, and brash demeanor made him a media darling, and he reveled in the attention, earning the nickname the Dapper Don from the press. Gotti's high-profile lifestyle and frequent appearances in the media set him apart from other mob bosses, but it also made him a prime target for law enforcement. Despite numerous attempts to prosecute him, Gotti managed to avoid conviction in the 1980s, leading to his Teflon Don moniker, as charges seemed to slide off him without sticking. Gotti's rise to power was as dramatic as his public persona. In 1985, he orchestrated the assassination of Paul Castellano, then the head of the Gambino family, in a bold move that shocked the underworld. The hit took place outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, a brazen public execution that signaled Gotti's ruthless ambition. With Castellano out of the way, Gotti seized control of the Gambino family, cementing his position as one of the most powerful mob bosses in the country. However, Gotti's reign was short-lived. His flamboyance and high visibility made him a target, and eventually the law caught up with him. In 1992, after years of evading justice, Gotti was convicted on multiple charges, including murder, racketeering, and tax evasion, thanks in large part to the testimony of his former underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gotti was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, marking the end of his reign and the fall of one of the Mafia's most infamous figures, Sam Giancana. Sam Giancana was a powerful and enigmatic figure in the world of organized crime, known for his iron grip on Chicago's criminal underworld during the mid-20th century. Born in 1908 to Italian immigrants in Chicago, Giancana rose from the rough streets of the city to become the head of the Chicago outfit, a position that gave him control over a vast network of illegal activities, including gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics trafficking. Under his leadership, the Chicago outfit became one of the most powerful crime syndicates in the United States, with Giancana exerting influence not only in Chicago, but across the country and even internationally. His ability to blend brutality with strategic alliances allowed him to maintain his position of power for years, and he became known as a shrewd and ruthless operator who was as comfortable dealing with politicians as he was with fellow mobsters. Giancana's criminal career took a particularly intriguing turn when he allegedly became involved with the CIA in the early 1960s. According to various reports and investigations, Giancana was recruited by the agency as part of a plot to assassinate Cuban leader Fidel Castro. The connection between the Mafia and the U.S. government, particularly in this covert operation, highlighted the complex and sometimes surprising relationships that existed between organized crime and official institutions during the Cold War. However, Giancana's life came to a sudden and mysterious end in 1975, just as he was about to testify before a grand jury investigating Mafia ties to the CIA and other high-profile crimes. He was found murdered in his own home, shot multiple times in what appeared to be a professional hit. The timing and circumstances of his death have fueled speculation and conspiracy theories for decades, leaving many questions unanswered about the true nature of his connections and the reasons behind his assassination. Whitey Bulger. Whitey Bulger, the notorious leader of the Winter Hill Gang, carved out a fearsome reputation in Boston's underworld during the latter half of the 20th century. Born in 1929 in Boston, Bulger grew up in the city's rough-and-tumble neighborhoods, eventually finding his way into the world of organized crime. By the 1970s, he had risen to the top of the Winter Hill Gang, a predominantly Irish-American criminal organization that controlled much of the illicit activity in the Boston area, including drug trafficking, extortion, and loan sharking. Bulger was known for his ruthless enforcement of power, instilling fear in both rivals and allies alike. However, what truly set Bulger apart from other mobsters was his secretive and highly controversial relationship with the FBI. Starting in the mid-1970s, Bulger became an informant for the Bureau, providing information on his competitors in the Italian-American Mafia, while simultaneously expanding his own criminal empire with little interference from law enforcement. This double life eventually led to Bulger's downfall as the truth about his informant status came to light, causing shockwaves in both the criminal world and law enforcement. His betrayal of criminal associates, combined with the corruption within the FBI that allowed him to operate with impunity for years, resulted in a complex web of deception and violence. In 1994, as federal authorities closed in on him, Bulger went on the run, eluding capture for 16 years. His ability to remain hidden for so long became the stuff of legend, with sightings reported across the globe. However, in 2011, Bulger was finally captured in Santa Monica, California, living under an assumed identity with his longtime girlfriend. His trial in 2013 brought to light the full extent of his crimes, including his involvement in multiple murders, extortion, and drug trafficking. Convicted on 31 counts, including 11 murders, Bulger was sentenced to life in prison, where he met a violent end in 2018 at the hands of fellow inmates. As we close the book on these infamous mob bosses, one thing is clear. Their reigns of terror left indelible marks on American history and pop culture. Each figure we've explored dominated their era with ruthless ambition, but in the end, even the most powerful mafiosos met their downfall, proving that crime always comes with a price. Yet, their names live on, immortalized in stories, films, and whispered legends that refuse to fade away. Though the mob's influence may have waned, the chilling legacy of these notorious bosses still lingers, a haunting reminder of the darker side of the American dream.